Today I want to discuss how I dye and stain curly maple to get that really punchy look that you often see on guitars, where the curl itself has a deeper color to it, and then on top is something slightly lighter, and it just punches you in the face with the look. Now, it's not a look for everyone, and you can change a lot about these solutions to kind of temper the curl a little bit or make it really contrasting. So I'm going to go over some examples as well as my process, but just know that this is a lot of trial and error, a lot of testing, and there are a million different color options you can go with. So I can only share what I've done and only show you what I have with me here. So follow the process, but the color choice is totally up to you. Now let's start with the two basic options here. I'm an oil-based stain guy, so all of this is going to be in reference to oil-based stain, though I don't think it should make any difference if you want to use water-based, so I'll just say that now. Or you can go with the classic dye, this heavily concentrated dye. TransTint is the most common one. I love it, it's great, but I think it's a little expensive if you're only going to use it once. I don't know, it's up to you. It's a slightly similar but also slightly different process, and it is a little easier with the dye, but it's no problem with the stain either. So if you've already got some stains in your house and you want to try this out, don't feel like you need to go buy the dye right away until you figure out whether you like the concept. So let's go through these one by one here and talk about the pros and the cons of each of them. The dye, the traditional method, is, in my opinion, a little easier and maybe a little safer if you're worried about oil-based things. You basically take this heavily concentrated color, or two colors, we'll talk about that in a second, and you kind of create a certain solution level of it. How much do you want to dilute it to get a certain shade of the given color? Now, historically, with the dye, I've only used one color at a time. I start with a much more concentrated amount for the first layer, sand off, and then apply a lighter concentration. But many people will use a dark color underneath and then a blue or a red or something really bombastic for musical instruments. You can mix colors as you want. Just the darker one or the more heavily kind of concentrated version goes on first. Now, the main upside of this, in my opinion, is the application and ease using water. You can use denatured alcohol, and I attempted it with both, which is why I have this. And also, it's never been used again because it was not fun. I didn't like it at all. It evaporates way too fast for me over a large surface. I go with water. Yes, it will raise the grain, but that's okay because we have to do some sanding anyways, and because this is a little bit specific to your finish. If you're going to spray a finish over, you're more comfortable going with water here. If you want to just kind of put some type of oil finish on top, you're getting a little sketchier with the water base, and you may need to go with the denatured alcohol base, but it's very awkward to apply. It just evaporates so fast, and we need this spread out, soaking in a little bit before we wipe it off. I don't quite understand why some people prefer that, but maybe it's the drying time they want. Maybe they want it done much faster, in which case, fair enough. So all of TransTint's dyes come in little bottles like this, and all I would say is keep it inside of another bag because it just kind of mystically leaks on its own, and it will stain anything. It feels like it's capped up, but somehow there's always some squirting out. So keep it in something else. I've had this for a couple years, and it hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there, so it doesn't evaporate really quickly once you open it. Every one of these has a base concentration of about 16 drops per ounce of water. You do kind of need a scale or some kind of kitchen measuring cup to do this precisely, but you can kind of play around with it too. So therefore, our double concentration will be 32 drops per ounce, and you could keep going from there if you want, but I've found that 2x and 1x is ideal. And the premise here is we simply do the double solution, the double concentrate, the 2x, 32 drops per ounce as our base layer. We then allow that to dry. We then come back with sandpaper, 220, 180, something like that, and we remove the surface level. We only want that initial 2x concentration to be left inside of the curl. Once we've got that top removed, then you can either go with the 1x, which I traditionally do, of the same color, or you pick a second color and layer that on top. Some people like to go very contrasting. That's up to you. Now, I've found with the water-based ones, lacquer, polyurethane, something more plasticky or filmy, I should say, over the top seems to pop a little better. You'll notice when you apply this, it looks kind of drab and dull. I don't know, it just doesn't pop. You put that lacquer on top, boom, it looks amazing. You can apply boiled linseed oil or tung oil blends on top, and it will help, but it's not quite as stark until you build up more of a sheen. If you want that quick satisfaction, lacquer over the top will just boom right away. So the dye, very basic. I prefer water. You can use denatured alcohol if you want, but just be warned, do some testing first. It dries really quickly. Make sure that you can do it in time, because in theory you'd like to leave it on for a few minutes and then wipe it off, but it just dries so fast. That's my only warning with this. We'll do testing with all of these, but I want to cover the stain method first. So a relatively similar process here, but a slower kind of timetable to get this done. I'm an oil-based stain person, like I said, but I don't really see a big difference in using the water-based. We still sand anyway, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. When I pick the stains, I like to go pretty dark as my base layer, because most stains are relatively dark in general unless you get something very light. However, we can also dilute stains using mineral spirits. So you can use the same color in the same kind of concept of trick of full strength, and then dilute it 50%, 30%, whatever, and go over the top like that. Again, you want it to fully dry within the figure, but just over the whole board before you sand it all off. And there's a very fine line between sanding too much off and not sanding enough off. We really want to get that layer of area that's not the figure itself to be pretty darn close to clean. Then we want to apply the regular strength. Sometimes you oversand a little bit and you start removing some from the curl. If that starts to happen, do not keep sanding in that area, or if you're worried, you may have to go reapply that second or that double strength or full strength back onto the board and start over again. Now, I've done some pretty interesting kind of wacky-ish color combinations here. One of my favorite is to get very dark and go with the straight up ebony, like straight up black, or the Kona or cognac or something like that, and then pick a lighter cherry, and you get quite literally this kind of tiger effect on there of these black stripes and this orangish red on top. That's one of my personal favorites. I do it probably more than I should, but I think it looks really cool. So we're gonna go through, we'll do some testing. I've got a variety of different pieces of maple from different boards, so you can see kind of the different starting color and how it looks after. I've also got a little bit of hard maple here from my personal tree that I milled up, and we'll do it on that. It doesn't look quite as good when you've got heartwood in there, so you'll see this darker area. It's not as noticeable because that ends up relatively dark too. And we'll go through and we'll do both the dye and some different stain combinations so you can see, and I'll talk a little bit about how I do each step along the way. We're going to begin with the stain, and we're first going to sand to 180 or 220 grit. I like to go 220, but either or, if your stain specifically calls for a certain grit, go ahead and go to that and just follow their instructions. We just want to get it nice and abraded and pretty much no kind of obvious scratches in there, as they will show up much more once we apply the second color or lighter kind of diluted amount of color. They're noticeable, so try to make sure all of them are out of there. But we're going to go to 220 first, and for the double kind of look, we're going to apply the darker first. So either a dark stain itself or a color, then you're going to later apply a more diluted version of that color, if that makes sense. I'm just going straight up ebony stain here, but ebony, Kona, cognac, those are all dark stain colors that do a pretty good job here. Some of you may find the ebony too dark. That's totally fine. It's up to you. I'm just going to sand, apply it for 7 minutes, wipe it off, let it sit overnight. I want this dry. Trying to sand off that initial layer when it is tacky or moist at all, you will run through sandpaper like crazy. It will just clog the whole thing up. So if you are using an oil-based stain or a stain in general for these process, make sure that initial base coat is fully dry before you try and sand it off of there, or you will have a bad time. Now, before I apply the black, I just want to add one note here from things I've learned in the past, and it's that this effect doesn't naturally translate to the end grain, right? We don't get that nice figure look down the end grain. So you have a couple problems here. The first is that if you apply the darken all over, it's just gonna be dark on the end grain. Whatever that color is, that's gonna be the end grain. So if your project has a lot of noticeable end grain, those are gonna be very clear, dark areas. It's very hard to sand enough of an end grain to get all the stain out of there. So if you do not want the end grain to be dark, you either need to not use a very dark color or be extremely careful when applying this. However, you can get around this a bit if you want to intentionally carry over the look by, I'll call it painting it on yourself. So let's say we're going to have exposed end grain somewhere and we don't want it to just be black, but we want that curl to be really dark under some other color. So we want to go with black or a very dark brown. What I've kind of thought of and tested a little bit but never done on a final project is quite literally getting a paintbrush out, applying stain to all of this very carefully, and then just painting some stripes down the side with a dark color, making sure not to get all of the stain all over it and just leaving that to dry. And then when we come back to apply the other color, we just let that lighter color go all over it, and it carries enough to visually make you not notice it. But if you just apply that the darker of the two shades or the two dilutions, it's going to be very noticeable. I like to use this a lot on mitered boxes where there is no end grain. You just never see or have that problem whatsoever. But that's just one warning I wanted to give. The second warning is please make sure you test all of this before you do it on your piece. To get the darker shade out of the curl takes a lot of material removal. I'm talking like let it dry, put it through the planer kind of stuff. It takes a long time to sand the darker out of the curl because the whole point is the figure will take more of the dye so that when we sand the surface off, it will still be left in there. So please make sure you are 100% committed to this before you apply the darker color. Remove all the dust from this, whether air compressor, whether rub it down with mineral spirits. We just want to get the dust off of there so we're not clogging any pores. And we're just going to go ahead and apply the dark stain now. And then after that, I'll go ahead and apply the double concentration of the dye. Now, I generally err towards painting things on. You can do it however you want. I think you get a deeper kind of seeping in if you flood it with the color, but maybe you don't want that. Maybe you just want a light, quick rub on with a towel of some sort of cloth. But I prefer to paint it on because I want that color deep and in there. You can already see right away the figure taking in more of the stain quicker. You can either just leave it with that amount on there or you can keep applying more. That's totally up to you. I generally apply a little more after I start seeing it sink away, but you can see it being pulled down into that figure area, which is taking in more stain in a deeper grain. Moving on to the dye, Transtant recommends using distilled water if you plan to go with any kind of light color. They talk about mineral staining in little spots from tap water or even bottled water if the color's pretty light. If you're going with something fairly dark, I always just use bottled water, so that's up to you. But if you're going very faint, consider getting a jug of distilled water to do this. Now, many people don't have a kitchen scale. If you have any of these little kind of bathroom cups, these are 3 ounces, so you can kind of eyeball your way through. Remember, it's tapered, so it'll have to be higher on the lower third than the middle and upper third. I generally just do a 2x strength dye for the base layer. You can go darker, you can go lighter. Some people do a very subtle kind of darkening hint to this. So 1 ounce, 32 drops is all I'm going with here. In my experience with this, I simultaneously need more than I usually make, but then less than I end up making in the end. Fortunately, when we know the dilution, we know that we can make the same color again, roughly or close enough. I always don't make enough the first time, and then I end up making too much, trying to make up more. So it's hard to explain, but be prepared to have to make a second batch. You can also just make this into, I think, a quart, something like that, or a large amount. This whole bottle can go into that if you are really into the color and you want to just pre-mix it at a certain solution and keep it that way. Now with this one, I do a little more kind of flooding on and paying attention to it. I want to keep areas wet until the total 10 minutes or so is over with. I don't just put it on and walk away. I want to make sure it's getting deep in there, and so I keep an eye on it. I like the fact that it can be water-based. Again, that's personal for me. It's much easier to work with and clean up. There is a list also on Transtint's website of things you cannot add this to. Some people like to add this to other finishes. They have a list of specific finishes you cannot mix this in or known problems. So if you're thinking of putting this into something, a polyurethane, tung oil, whatever, don't take my word for anything here and go read that because I have no experience with that. I just remember from when I was doing it very specifically, there are certain things you should not mix it into. It just won't work well. Do not get this on anything. It will stain. If you get this onto some sort of clothing, it's going to stain. So be very careful with this. It's going to stain whatever it gets onto your finger. Well, I guess mine are already nice and dark from the other staining, but it will stain. Make sure you stir this thoroughly, as we want this to be a uniform color throughout the entire project. I've gone with about 1.5 ounces here, so 48 drops. It's probably too much. I'll throw the rest of it on something else and we'll stain or dye something else. You can see though, when it's water-based, it moves so much easier. And since you really ideally want to keep it wet, it's just so much nicer. Of course, it does raise the grain, but since we're going to be sanding anyways, and then that final coat won't raise the grain too much, as it will have been raised and sanded. Don't panic when it dries and it doesn't look great. Trust me, the finish in the end with lacquer or something like that really brings it all together. It's very disappointing until you get to that point, especially once it dries here. Once your 7 to 10 minutes are up for anything water-based, I'm gonna just wipe it off, and you can either lay out these to dry or just pitch them right away. For anything oil-based, wipe it off. You gotta lay them out to dry. You want them to harden. Make sure you let these sit overnight, maybe 2 days. We want these entirely dry before we sand them. And honestly, there are some people who only put one coat on and spray a finish on after that, and it can look quite good on its own, but we can get it looking even better, in my opinion, when we do the more diluted coat after this. I'm back about 24, 28-ish hours later. All of this is nice and dry. As you can see, it doesn't look particularly striking, even just with that one coat, when there's no finish on top. But trust me, even if you only want to do one coat, it improves significantly in the look if you spray it with some lacquer or polyurethane. It's surprisingly better. However, all of these are now done, so we need to now remove the top layer so that all that is left is that kind of curl, that darker figure with the stain or dye sunk deeper into it. And you have to kind of be a little careful when you do this. You want to keep the sander moving. We don't want to go too far in one area and not others. Sometimes you then have to start over with the double stain, or the double kind of solution of stain, the 2X, that's what I'm looking for, to get back into the figure. So there's a real delicacy to this. If you have any sandpaper that is not the mesh kind, feel free to use that, because it's kind of messy and nasty and it will get in there. Even when it's dry, it'll still clog these a little more. I don't know if that's just because the pigment's in there. Whatever it is, you're gonna go through more sandpaper than you'd probably normally go through. If you wanna start with hand sanding, that's fine. I only do 220, you can do 180, whichever of those two grits you want. We don't want big scratches. We don't want scratches going down into the figure. So stick with 180 or 220, even if it's going to be a little slower. We don't want to have to go even deeper and start taking out that dye or stain in the curl. I've got my sanding done here, and I stopped at what I would consider the minimum level you need to get this effect to work correctly. I'm going to bring you in so you can get a closer look, so you can see, does mine or yours match this as the minimum level? You can take more off. You can leave less and less and less of the dark if you want. You can go as far down that there's only dark in very specific deepest parts of the grain. But I went as far as I historically go to get the effect I'm looking for. So let's come in here. You can get a look and you can see, do you want to stop at this point? Do you not? Also, it's going to look really bad at this point, and you're going to worry that you've ruined the project. Don't. Stay the course. Finish this all the way through and you'll get there. This is what we're looking at here. Obviously, the lighter brown ones are dyed, and this is the minimum amount you should be sanding to. If you want to keep going until there's only dark left inside the figure, that's fine, but there's a very fine line between taking too much off and not having enough left in the curl. Well, the last couple times I've used the dark, I actually left a fair bit on there. You'll still get the effect like this, but if you only want the dark curl, you can keep going, of course. One of the things you have to be careful with on smaller pieces is taking it all off of the ends there, and then not having, just kind of having this very stark contrast on the end. It's very easy to do with some kind of powered sander, so if you need to on small parts, use your hand and just do it by hand. It sucks, but it'll work. This is the point where you have to choose your other color. Now, whether that's a more diluted version of the original or something totally different. For the dyed ones, I'm just going to do a 1X solution. So for TransTint, 16 drops per ounce of water is what I'm using. And then for stain, I'm just going to use a normal strength, lighter cherry color stain that's not going to cover up the dark at all. But it's totally up to you. You can go lighter, darker, mix and match. Crazy if you want, with some blues, greens, all kinds of stuff. Check out guitars. A lot of Curly Maple backed guitars do really cool dye work. You can get some ideas there. Now, one thing we want to do before we apply this is to wipe these off as much as possible. We don't want any dust left in there. Once we apply the next coat, there's not really any sanding to do other than maybe some quadruplat steel wool knocking down any remaining fibers. on any sort of water-based stuff. We can't go back and sand it. We're going to start removing more dye. So once we apply this next one, we then are going to spray on top with just minimal kind of knocking off some high spots. So make sure everything is clean and ready now. And when we go to spray this, if you're going to spray, it needs to be in an area where we're not going to get a lot of dust, because you have to be very careful when you're doing any kind of sanding between coats as well, not to remove material from the actual color dyed areas. Once you've got your lighter or other colored second coat applied, let it sit for 6 to 10 minutes, something like that, depending upon how much you want it to sink in. Wipe it all off, and then we really want to let these all dry. We're going to spray them, or I think personally that's the ideal finish for these. We want absolutely to know it's dry, whether you let it sit 2 days, 3 days. If you want to go after one, that's fine, but I would recommend sticking it in front of a pretty good fan overnight then if you're in a rush. For me, 2 days at least is what I let this dry. I don't want any problems with the lacquer. At this point, these pieces are all sufficiently dry and we can now spray them. I'm fairly happy with how they came out. Perhaps I should have put a second coat of the cherry color on this to get a little more of the red. In the past, I've only needed one coat to get a little more, but I think they'll look still pretty good with the lacquer sprayed on, and it will serve the point of this video to show you how to do it. Now, prior to spraying, if there's any kind of raised grain or fuzz left, which there really shouldn't be, just knock it down really quick with some quadruplet steel wool or even a paper towel and just going over it, and it should knock any of the rest off. But we want to do that now before we spray. Hey, you gonna come for a visit? And after the lacquer has been applied, they are all but done. Personally, I like to put wax over lacquer. That's entirely a personal choice. If you want to stop there, I just like to buff it out a little bit with some quadruplet steel wool and then wipe it off with a paper towel. Word of warning, wax easier to fix for minor blemishes, much harder to fix for major blemishes. So if you're going to go the lacquer route, that's kind of the trade-off with the wax. Minor kind of little scrapes, you can buff wax on there. Anything major, getting that wax off of there is a real pain. Whereas the lacquer, you can obviously do a little light sand and reapply a new coat over it. After a little wax on, wax off, Mr. Miyagi, they're all good to go. Now remember, my aesthetic choices don't have to be your aesthetic choices. You may think some of these are very ugly. That's totally fine. The point of this video is to learn how to do the process, or rather for me to impart upon you the things I've learned. There may be other methods, there may be people who know it a little better, maybe some tips and tricks. I've gotten what I consider to be acceptable success so far out of this, so hopefully this can at least get you a base point to jump off from. And we just get that lovely kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, directional change of the chatoyancy when we move these through light. The more figure you have, the better it's going to look. I'll just say that right away. You can see the top of this here versus kind of this open area there. If you got something heavily figured, it's going to look amazing. This is my Tiger Stripe blend. Not as cherry red as I'd hoped it would turn out. I've had better success in the past. For whatever reason, maybe I forgot to mix the stain. I shouldn't think about that, to be honest. I'm not entirely sure. But I love the effect nonetheless. We'll come in for a little bit of a closer look here. Oh, I love it. And that's going to do it for today. Thank you for joining me. If you have any questions, leave them below. If you have any tips, let me know. And goodbye.